Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Zombies are boring. A Valarie LeFevre Misadventure by Valarie 64. Karen stared in abject misery, the bitter taste of the draught that she had slaked her thirst still on her tongue. Her thoughts had sunken into the last depths of hopelessness as the horrid creature approached her bound form. She was no longer sure of whether it was a mask or an actual, living, maybe undead visage. Her husband, Albert, was chained next to her, his unconscious, for all she knew, lifeless body slumped on the floor, as much as his restraints would allow. The rhythmic bass thump of the heavy drums throbbed in her ears and preyed on her nerves. It engendered dark and violent thoughts, stirred from the depths of her unconscious mind. They were war drums and brought anger and the lust for mayhem. Her vision had blurred when she'd lost, or had removed from her, the stylish eyewear that Albert had bought for her. The hypnotically dancing figure leaped and cavorted, growing closer to her after each stunning gyration. The space in which she was confined was mostly dark, illuminated only by feeble, smoking candles that gave off an odd, spicy aroma, and the orange coals within the brazier. The light from that blaze was directly ahead of her, and occluded only by means of the capering figure before her. The light appeared and disappeared with the movements of the body to the pounding of the drums. It initially assaulted her vision and added to the throbbing at the front of her head, a pounding ache that increased in sharpness as the monstrous face grew nearer and larger in her perception, a low chant impinging between the thumps of bass, and she felt as though sand poured into her ears to fill the void that had begun to form in the interior of her skull, shutting out her conscious will. Boring, Val thought as she perused the article in the local news and on social media. Plenty of murder and mayhem, but nothing mysterious, just typical milk of human kindness that her species showed to one another on a daily basis. No fun monsters, just everyday ones, she noted. She was still getting accustomed to her new home. She decided to get away from the urban morass and increasing lawlessness that it contained. There had been a riot that made it all too near to her townhome, violence that had spilled from the bowels of the nearby inner-city blight, brought about by years of despair, chaos, and too many people who talked of helping, but came only to teach more helplessness and take what they could. Perhaps the talkers would add some new language and labels for the horrors that humanity had inflicted on itself from the beginning. This new place was more expensive, but it was one of the few suburbs that had not yet been overrun with two-legged rats, or people, fleeing the metropolitan nightmare to seek utopian dreams. Probably the neighborhood restrictions, she considered. Most of them couldn't afford these homes. I can barely do so, and would not have without the money from the sale of my townhome. I can't believe those people paid me what they did for a place on the downhill slide. More restrictions and fewer freedoms seemed to come along with paying more for a home, at least one near enough to her office to make it tenable. It was nice enough, though, built just prior to the craze for McMansions came into vogue, so there was more yard than home. At any rate, she was bored by the lack of newsworthy activity. No murder mutilations for weeks. No mysterious dark figures haunting the shadows. No unexplained disappearances. She sighed. Then an article caught her attention. The incident had occurred in her neighborhood, no more than a few blocks from her home she now occupied, and which she had yet to fully unpack and emplace her possessions. Maybe I haven't escaped the crime wave, she muttered as she leaned forward and absorbed the story that contained so few details. Londonderry Estates couple missing. A couple in their 50s is missing from their home in Londonderry Estates. Albert and Karen Rizzo have been out of contact with friends and relatives since last Friday evening, their daughter Gemma reported. I talked to them like Friday afternoon, and my mom was like, "We aren't doing anything this weekend. Dad may play some golf." And that was like the last I ever heard from them. It's been nearly a week since the couple was last seen, and according to the police, there has been no contact or traceable activity from the couple. They are in good health, and authorities are asking that anyone with information should contact. "Whee! That's the one, Scoob," Valarie exclaimed. "I can feel it in my bones. Something awful has happened to those people." She spent the next few hours finding out what she could about the pair and looked for anything similar that had occurred in recent months in the area. There had been 2 other couples of similar backgrounds and means reported missing, but they were from estates farther out from the city. There were 2 other similar disappearances in town. One was near her old townhome, and the other between there and her new neighborhood. Hitting too close to home. I wonder if I should take it personally, she inquired of her screen. She decided that she could waive her worries for the moment and do some more research. She looked for other patterns and noticed that the dates were spaced as evenly as the locations, and they coincided with the dark of the moon. Definitely not my lupine and canine friends. Maybe more vamps. But I think we have a new category of mystery on our hands, Reggie. Wish Earl and Lacey were here with me instead of the imaginary Scooby-Doo gang. She said the last sadly. It'd be handy to have sniffers of their magnitude on the trail. It'd be real fun to have the whole pack. We'd have this handled in no time flat. The Werewolf of Londonderry Estates, or Earl and the Dogman. She leaned back and grinned. Then she typed out what she'd discovered so far. All couples and all retired from biotech or medical science sectors. Only the last couple had any children, the one adult daughter, like Gemma. Limited social media accounts and social networking. Nerds. No serious criminal records, just traffic stuff. Recorded locally. No NCIS or state system records. Not active in clubs or social organizations. Incomes above median, but not truly wealthy. Plenty of diversity for such a small group. No patterns in that regard. All owned property near White Sands Lake. Recreational and retirement properties, and each owned at least 4 decades, all in one section, of the northeast end of the lake. People missing near White Sands Lake, Valarie LeFevre read out loud. She had learned to use off-the-beaten electronic path and conspiracy sites and articles in her research with the general news articles. About the same level of credibility, she mentally noted. Check that. The conspiracy nuts are usually more accurate than commercial media. This headline was from one of the conspiracy sites, but it may have been connected to another story on a local news site that was usually fairly accurate. That one had spoken of weekenders going missing when they visited the lake, a place that had been highly popular back during the 1970s and early 80s. These days, people still traveled the 80 to 120 miles from various parts of the Metroplex to get to the rustic lakeside and escape the pressures and fears that plagued more settled places. Many retired in that area, though much of it was crowded and aging poorly for the most part, as were many of its inhabitants. Val's hometown was a mere 45 road miles from the small city that perched on its shores near the dam that created the backflow and filled the former valleys. It was considerably closer across country, but impassable with the thick piney woods that covered hills and swamps. In more recent times, White Sands City boasted 4 large corporate box stores and a bypass that took one away from the old town charms that had been relegated to rows of antique shops and family-owned restaurants. Uncle Earl had taken her there for a meal back during Lacey's early days as, well, whatever she was. Dog person? Currently on the northeast end of the lake, where people had once built large, expensive homes, there were several unexplained disappearances and possibly some other unusual, maybe even paranormal activity. Val was intrigued because of the woods on that side of the lake between White Sands City and on the far southeastern end and the northeast settlements. Near where the last bridge spanned the river before it spread into the wider regions of the lake were the same that extended all the way to her little wide spot in the Roud hometown and far beyond. Lacey's woods, she smiled. While a little too far westish, she might still roam through on occasion. One of her boundaries was a small river that eventually wound its way to feed the lake. There were other settlements on that side of the lake, east of the estates, but they quickly gave way to farmsteads, and then mill-owned tracts of planted trees that went on for miles. The towns along the east side of the lake were odd, too. They all had Russian names, in English lettering and colloquial pronunciations, of course, but still the area wasn't particularly known for having a large number of Russian settlers. Only a few who had run several trading posts in the late 19th century. Money always talks. Guess a few inventors wanted to preserve some hints of their motherland. The river hadn't been dammed, and the lake filled until the mid-1960s at the height of the Cold War. Even during those times, there had been no effort to change the names, and the ethnic Russians had mostly departed or assimilated. She wondered why none of the local good American types hadn't changed the names as she continued to browse. Too lazy or too stubborn? Maybe both. Darwinius? Narcissus smiled in satisfaction. The keeper, as he knew his latest nefarious contact, had paid him well to capture and prepare the zombies, what those at the facility called the Z-Tech and the Z-Squad. It had been delicate spell work on his part, especially for the Z-Tech. He had to remove the wills without damaging the knowledge they'd learned over entire careers. He was certain that the keeper was not the one who supplied the excellent delivery fees. The keeper wasn't too bright, and humans were an expensive commodity, at least the ones with education and value to others than themselves and now robbed of free will. Darwinius possessed talents and abilities that added even more to the price tag. Yet the keeper handily paid without argument or negotiation. He was definitely neck-deep in some illegal scheme or schemes. Darwinius didn't care. He'd done his part and would take a few more individuals that the keeper had requested, far from his first crimes in this country. Afterwards, as part of the deal, he would check in from time to time to ensure the zombies remained diligent and asked no questions of themselves. Standard contract. It was even easier to work on the Z-Squad. Essentially labor drones. No need to preserve much of their minds at all. Fortunately, he was able to gather the herbs and spices he needed to fry the brains of these chickens locally. He cackled out loud. Not enough voodoo practitioners made a good living in these cynical times. He would soon have enough to retire and enjoy his elder years back home in Haiti. Val plopped her keys on the counter and made her way to the shower. She'd just completed her fight night workout sparring match. She did those twice per week. The rest of the time she spent on general fitness and other fighting skills. She couldn't find or afford ammunition for actual shooting as often as she liked, but she was able to practice, drawing, getting online, and triggering control. She found a range that had some good simulator drills and given them a try. No monster silhouettes or video targets. Only humans playing nasty roles for the video scenarios and hulking menacingly on the fixed targets. She knew from experience that humans could be more monstrous than any mere mythological creature that happened to sprout up in the dark corners of human-settled places. She had to stay prepared. There wouldn't always be convenient pools of gasoline to fire up slathering, bloodthirsty vampires, or lighting quick sinews of allied monsters to leap to her aid against their own kind. Once she was refreshed and ready to settle down for the evening, as much as she ever did, she checked and responded to messages, and then checked the headlines once more. This time she looked at instances that may have occurred near White Sands Lake, in the nice but older sections around the northeast quadrant. She found two, one shortly before Rizzo's disappearance, and one immediately after. These people had all been vacation neighbors, more or less. They'd all been in similar professions, and they'd all lived similar lifestyles. It was partly generalization, but when she started looking more closely, she found they'd also worked in the city at the medical center, a large complex of various companies and hospitals, many dedicated to health research and lab tech work. There were only a couple of direct connections between the missing that she could find online. Limited social media mentions and mutual friends listed. Weird, she decided, like a generation of people who worked in a place that was a hotbed for employment, who shared recreational interests, and who all picked properties in the same estates. Granted, they were popular at the time. The medical center had been a major employer for long enough, though still weird that no other professions had been part of the property owners. Maybe they'd been in some sort of exclusive medical researchers club or medical mafia? No matter how they'd settled the area, they were now all gone. In most of the disappearance cases, they left behind some sibling or other single relative, or just an attorney to settle their affairs. The larger scale media didn't give the story much attention. The disappearances had occurred in different jurisdictions, and they were more interested in fabricating political hash than attempting to locate people for whom few cared. These were boomers and Xers, not young, good-looking people who mattered. Val rolled her eyes at her own thoughts. I'm getting grouchy in my dotage. At 27, I'm officially in my late 20s. I'm not supposed to like these Neanderthal types, but I catch myself preferring them over my own generation. She thought again of Earl, now Earl Wolf. He had some possibilities. Too bad one of us was born in the wrong era. There was only one thing she could do: travel out towards White Sands Lake this weekend to search for clues on the ground. If nothing else, it would be a nice drive, and perhaps she'd see some standard wildlife. Wait, she admonished herself. The part of the drive where I encountered the Elbert werewolves is just east of White Sands Lake. She couldn't see how there could be a connection, but I'd never take a bet on coincidences after what I'd seen. Dr. Ignat Zloivuk looked over his glasses at specimen CLHSS044. Klaus. Someone had dubbed the creature after some cartoon show character because it was smarter than it looked and far more intelligent than the run-of-the-mill specimen. It lounged in its enclosure. The enormous beast breathed slowly and kept its nose and ears aimed in his direction, and he caught occasional glints as it slitted its eyes open. Always waiting, my friend, hoping for a chance to roar, leap, and devour me. He chuckled internally. He made some notes on his pad and turned to the keeper. Is he still eating sparsely? The scruffy little man nodded. Yeah, Dr. Z. It don't eat half what we give it, and no two-legged meat other than the occasional whole chicken. Still, it has a nasty temper, but it ain't tried to bite anybody in a while. Just growls and slobbers. It don't like that cage. Dr. Z, as everyone called him, since they could rarely pronounce either of his names correctly, nodded in return. Yes, it is a dangerous beast. It yearns for the wild and never forget. It yearns also for human flesh and blood, for that is its nature. Unusual that it resists eating what it was made to devour. However, we will want to keep it a while longer. Then we can be done with it permanently. Notice that the wounds from his capture healed so quickly that they hardly left scars. That's what we need from the beast, its healing factor. This one may have some other qualities as well. We will have to experiment while we work on our normal processes. Most of them simply gnaw on the barrier when they sense us. This one watches and bides its time. Very dangerous indeed. By the way, how are the latest Z-Techs performing? Has Comrade Narcisse kept the schedule? Has his work been effective to your knowledge? Oh yeah, Doc. He's a creepy little fellow, but he's kept his promises so far. The group is still at their jobs and nobody has bucked the system so far. The keeper saw that the good doctor may not have comprehended his vernacular. What I mean to say is they can do their jobs, but they ain't causing no problems. Dr. Zloivok smiled. He quite easily followed American idioms after 4 decades in the country. Yet he hoped to bring the language standards and the facility up to a better quality. He'd lost hope in the keeper, ever learning to speak above the 8th grade level. Yet the man served his purpose well. He wasn't stupid, just obstinately ignorant. At times his linguistic abilities seemed almost affected, and at other times he understood very well and occasionally slipped in a word or phrase that hinted of education and refinement. No matter, he decided. I need him to maintain and monitor the creatures in our menagerie and manage the nearly mindless workforce. And he is good at that. No leadership arts needed. Just management skills and a ruthless nature. He checked on several other specimens that were kept in sections separated so that none of the imprisoned could detect, much less communicate with one another, before he returned to his office. There was so much to do, but before he played his part in the great plan, he would enjoy seeing the West finally meet defeat, especially since he was highly placed among those who would rule the aftermath. If his experiments reached the ultimate conclusion, for which he hoped, he would rule with great and youthful vitality for many decades, despite his advanced age. Val absorbed the bucolic atmosphere as she left the city and the interstate and took less traveled farm-to-market roads, FMs, towards her destination. She decided on the town of Belgorod. 3 of the missing couples had lived in that area full-time after retirement. There was now a total of 13 missing people. 1 had been a recent widow, but otherwise met the standards. They had lake homes in a rough globular pattern on the map of the area around the northeast end of White Sands Lake. They'd all vanished without a trace. No preparation, no big grocery store runs, no ATM withdrawals or gasoline purchases. No one captured on video robbing, beating, or kidnapping him. There were residential security camera recordings for several of the couples, but none of them had captured any image at the time of the disappearances. Val had had to do some arm twisting and offer some bribes to get some of the information. She had become quite the old-style crusty investigator since she made her first trip back home to settle her brother's affairs. She recalled the night she encountered the Elbert werewolves. At the time, she hadn't been able to see much of the night-shadowed countryside. Now it was almost too brightly illuminated by the recently risen sun, other than a patch of woods that had been harvested by the timber companies since that time. There had been few substantive changes. The area remained as it had for decades. She still suffered some PTSD from that encounter, as much because she now understood just how unprepared she had been and how much she had relied on the good graces of Fortuna. In her nightmares, the pair of slathering fiends always cornered her. She had a pistol, but it always misfired and they sprang. There wasn't much more she could do differently now, but she'd be sure that her actions would have the desired outcome, instead of relying on serendipity. She now possessed the competence of someone with skills and knowledge, rather than the mere rush of adrenaline accompanied by keen mind combined with fortuitous circumstances. She considered whether she would have time to seek out Lacey and Earl, but decided to play it by ear. If she found out what she needed, or found nothing, she would make the rest of the drive towards their territory. Otherwise, she'd stay in this area or go home. It wasn't like she had nothing else to do. Monster hunting was, after all, a hobby rather than a profession. Not like it paid. The new modern convenience plaza that perched on the apex of the little knob hill that marked the center of Belgorod came into view. It sat at the intersection of the FM on which she traveled and a U.S. highway that cut through towards White Sands City in one direction and across the North End Bridge in the other. The plaza contained a large convenience-style store with an outsized beer cave and had 2 fast food restaurants attached. The entrepreneur who had envisioned the property had added a shower area for truckers or anyone else who wanted to rent a stall. There was a washateria on the same end as the showers. The complex was perfectly located to provide essential needs for the locals and travelers. If there was anyone talking or worth talking with, she had a good chance of finding him in this place. If not, she'd have to check out the local beer joints and, worst case, come by on Sunday and find the biggest church. The latter was the best option for finding gossip, but she'd have to waste time being bombarded by questions on whether she was a member, and the most of the gossip would be the detriment of current fellow members. It was still early on Saturday, so the place wasn't that busy. It was spring, so there were a few boaters and fisher folk. The locals had mostly already completed their trading and gone home to get work mowing or planting in some other way maintaining their homes and conveyances. Val pretended to shop for a while until the line thinned down to 2 people before she approached with a cool drink and prepared to speak with the clerk. The other employee on duty at the store had gone into the beer cave cooler and appeared busy preparing for the Saturday afternoon booze rush. Hassan, according to his nameplate, took care of the 2 people ahead of her and then looked up at Valarie. He paused with an intake of breath and then flashed a very white teeth at her in his most winning smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" Val noted that previously he had appeared a bit sullen and never said a word to the 2 men who had been ahead of her in line. Maybe he'd be willing to help since he clearly favored her. Some advantages to being a knockout, she said to herself, and the frivolous fun comment brought out her radiant smile. Hassan never had a chance. "Oh, just this little drinky." Hassan smiled and notified her that she did not have to pay the extra charge for the $4.06 drink that it would cost around $2 somewhere else. "So, Hassan, do you live around here?" Hassan smiled and nodded. "Do you maybe know the Elements? They're friends of my parents, and I want to check on them. They live nearby." Hassan's grin faded a little. "I have not seen them for several days. The sheriffs came by to ask yesterday. Nobody's seen them. I liked them very much. They were a nice couple." "Gotcha." Val smiled in a different way. If Hassan paid attention, he might realize that the new smile was that of a predator assessing prey. "Speaking of them as if you knew they were doomed, Hassan, old pal, I went by their house and no one answered. I guess I know why. They weren't there. She interspersed a mindless giggle. So did the sheriff say what happened to them? They were dear friends, and I promised my parents I would look in on them. Val batted her eyes in her best imitation of a hapless and helpless female. She hoped that Hassan was foolish enough to believe the act. He nodded nervously. Just that they are gone and nobody's seen them. Ali came by the day before they left. He seemed okay. It wasn't busy that afternoon. And I saw their car pass through the intersection going north. Strange, they never went that way. They usually went into town. He had spoken quietly and now caught himself. He realized that the good-looking woman had duped him into saying more than he had to the stupid sheriffs. He closed his mouth and looked blankly over her shoulder, as though anxious to keep the non-existent line moving. Valarie LeFevre was clearly dismissed. She shrugged in an absent way and let her jaw grow a little slack, and flounced out of the store like a vacuous ninny. Might as well play the part to the end. Carlos Forres, a.k.a. the Keeper, laughed in satisfaction as his most powerful and rage-filled charge tore apart its dinner alive. The man had been one of the high-scale maintenance workers, but had been caught running his mouth about the cool place he worked. Fortunately, it had been only his girlfriend. She was a big girl and made enough meat to feed 3 creatures. Carlos had made him watch and then questioned him. He tortured him, then questioned him some more, washed, rinsed, and repeated several times, until he was sure the fool hadn't blathered to anyone else. It was unlikely to matter. No one took these wood runners seriously, but the operators did not take chances. He'd been allowed to personally cut the girl into 3 parts, each of her chunky thighs and cankles, and then the rest of her in one of the bigger beasts. Like a divvied-up chicken, he smirked. It wasn't often that they'd had enough human meat for the critters, as he liked to call them. They usually bought from coyotes and other traffickers, who were flush with game at the moment. Carlos enjoyed inflicting suffering. Even more, he had a fetish for watching animals tear into live food. Years earlier, he'd worked at a zoo, but had been caught feeding live animals to the predators. He'd found work at a private collection, and now he was here in the boonies with a top-secret menagerie of the macabre. He was paid well, but his true reward was that he fed living creatures to predators regularly and got to watch his fill of the results. The prey was often enough of the 2-legged variety, and he savored every scream, every look of terror, every loss of bodily control when the monsters in their paddocks tore into their feasts. It was a great life for him, and while he didn't know the details of the great plan, he had a feeling that the job would sate his bloodlust for some time while it overflowed his bank account. He chuckled one last time as Genosqua snapped apart bones and sucked out the marrow. The meat hadn't lasted long, with those hard teeth chomping away, and the large maw slurping and gulping goblets of flesh and gore. Ah, the simple pleasures of life, he reveled. Time to get back to my other work, evaluating the status of the hard case werewolf. May have to put in a live person for that one. He managed to avoid eating the dead flesh, fresh as it was. He hoped that the traffickers would bring him a fresh load, perhaps some not fully grown. For some reason, the higher-pitched squeals of children seemed to infuriate werewolves and would spring on them mindlessly and shred them. Over too quickly for his taste, but one of them might entice the creature to dine. I'll bet his hunger beats him. They can only fight their instincts for so long, he chuckled in a manner that would frighten most sane humans. Val had studied her map once again. There was definitely a pattern to where the victims had lived or had vacation homes, but she didn't want to have to visit each property. They made a rough ring with a narrow part of the lake where the river started to slow and fill the low-lying land around it. There was a bridge at that end and started with a long jetty on one end, then spanned into the high arc that passed over the channel of the river and allowed boat traffic. Perhaps the point she sought was near the center of the group of homes. That was pretty simple discovery, if that was one, and she knew that it wouldn't take the detectives long to cipher out the same information she had. Fortunately, from her perspective, their hunt would involve several jurisdictions, and they wouldn't all want to be able to share information, so she had a little time. She decided to leave a few cryptic messages with her contacts so that they could follow the clues in case she failed. It would be nice to have help, but how many people can I tell about this stuff, she wondered. Monsters walk among us, at least in our periphery. She'd been sent to the funny farm, and I've become a big city girl. I couldn't survive that. No point in getting angry. I'm a solo act for the moment. I might end up staying that way. Can't seek out a social life when monster hunting takes so much time. She found that center of the ring of kidnappees offered several places where a person or group might disguise an operation, hide something, or commit acts beyond the scrutiny of others. The best option was a patch of woods just northeast of the lake, where the river joined it, and adjacent to the selection of properties. It was land that the state held so that they could tend to the bridge on that end and the public access routes that ran around the patch of trees on its side. She conducted an inventory of her backpack and checked her weapons. She decided on a small rifle with an excellent night vision device and the pistol that was her constant companion at her waist. She added a brush knife to go with the small dagger she kept in a bra scabbard. She donned boots, snakes in those woods. The rest of her clothing and gear would appear pretty normal for the area, especially for a gal on a hike. Everything else she placed in her pack, except for a few ration bars and her water bottle that she put in the cargo pocket of her pants. She wore a water pack under her backpack so that she was well supplied and would eat a hearty breakfast and drink her fill on the short drive. The warmth of spring was slow to come this year. There'd been a late and brutal freeze in winter. She had hoped that the insect population would suffer, but they apparently had not. The wildflowers painted the landscape in a dazzling array of hues. The morning sun was even more dazzling and cast a bright haze. It was a good day to be outdoors, and she planned to enjoy the hike as much as gather intelligence. "Merde!" she shrieked, as a large form loped out in front of her jeep. She barely got her foot on the brake pedal before she felt and heard the sickening impact of fast-moving metal and plastic against flesh and bone. She brought the vehicle to a stop and stepped out quickly to view the results. She knew that one had been the chafing and bruising caused by the safety belt. She was thankful that the airbag had not activated. The form had been sprawling onto the grassy shoulder of the roadway and now tried to lurch to its feet. "Wait, are you hurt? Let me get help," she called as she walked forward. "I have a first aid kit and we can call EMS." The figure ignored her and continued to rise. Then it continued some more. The ridiculously small head on top of huge, sloping shoulders swiveled towards her. The face, which was primitive but clearly intelligent to at least some degree, regarded her with fear. How could a being that stood nearly 7 feet tall be afraid? She wondered as her feet faltered and her hand absently sought the little pack at her waist. The creature looked around, dazed and confused. It looked up the short slope on the other side of the drainage ditch and into the dark shadows of the forest beyond. It limped forward and stepped over the ditch in one unsteady but lengthy stride. It was soon lost in the emerald embrace of the tangle that typically marked the verge of the woods in this area. She watched for a moment as the gargantuan figure faded from sight and sound so completely that she wasn't sure it had ever been present, except that there were prints on the ground from the injured leg, prints outlined in blood. She called out again, "I'm sorry. If you want help, I will try." Silence was all that greeted her. She shrugged. "Well, next time I see Lacey and Earl, I can warn them that there's a Bigfoot in their territory, or near it. Still not sure they range this far west." She used her forefinger to mark an invisible board. "Chalk up yet another legendary monster for Ms. Valarie Adventure LeFevre." The corner of the bumper was trashed, but there didn't appear to be any damage other than the expected crumpling. Nothing for it. Must forge ahead. She completed her drive with less enthusiasm, worrying over the health of the monster. Nope, I don't know that. The creature, maybe even a person, impinging on her conscious thoughts. She really was worried for it, but didn't know how to help. So she tried to focus on resolving the investigation at hand. She found a parking area with a trail that led down to the bridge, and a little marina in one direction, and into the trees in the other. There were helpful signs that indicated the species of different flora spaced along the trail. She noted the cameras on the light poles of the parking area. She took off her hat, faced the camera that aimed towards her, and waved. Never know. It may be the last image of me alive that anyone sees. Besides, if turds are lurking out there, maybe it will make them nervous that I'm alert. She reassured herself as she turned and started into the woods. Glad that old men of the forest lumbered into this patch a few miles down the road, she smiled. Earl had taught her that name for the Sasquatches. The big hairy fellow might hold a grudge. She missed Earl even more than Lacey, mainly because he could talk, at least once upon a time. She'd so far been unable to find evidence of a cure for werewolfism. She would always look he was worth saving, even if he was too old for her. After a few miles, with no signs of anything but the passage of a few Turons who littered within 50 feet of a trash receptacle, she began to have doubts about her plan. The patch of woods wasn't huge, and this trail looped all the way around and back to the parking area. There wasn't much space it did not cover. She'd seen all sorts of wildlife that dared the light of day. It was a beautiful nature path, and there was not even a vibe or a foul odor to indicate anything sinister. Before she realized it, she'd made it back to her Jeep. She brought out the picnic lunch, and while she munched, she considered, if there was some secret place, it could be within the circle of the trails. A circle within a circle. Appealing thought. Like an old-style round target. Yet she wasn't sure what she sought, and the thought of traipsing through the briar and vine-entangling verges, and the Japan-infested interior with no clear objective in mind was more than unappealing. In most of these words, a person could walk right past a door or even a structure and miss it. The exertion of her walk had fended off the morning chill, and by the time she'd cooled from her efforts, the world around her had warmed dramatically. It was normal. Everything here was frustratingly normal. It was driving her insane. She'd had a cool adventure on her way here, only to have the place she'd sought turn out to be a nothing burger. She peered at the uninviting wall of vegetation across the park road. The map had shown that it was a narrow spit of land that dropped off precipitously on the other side of the trees and led to the banks of the river as it entered the lake. The trees covered no more than a few hundred yards from the roadway of the riverside. The big hairy fellow had run across the road from that side, she realized. Maybe she should try and pick up his back trail, see where he'd been. Wherever he's going, he's limping, but from wherever he came, he was running. Why would something so large be so scared? So quoth this raven. One more chapter in this one, and then another small chapter. And I have been promised by Bear some wonderful new stuff on the Urban Fae, which will probably take us through summer at least. Have a thrilling Thursday, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.